Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my little Dune series. This is going to be the first of the films that I'll be tackling. This is the 1984 adaptation of the novel, the first novel, Dune, directed by David Lynch, also called Dune. Now, this movie was made for about $40 to $42 million, and that's 80s money, so for 80s, a budget that big, ooh, that's pretty big. If I remember correctly, that's around 10 million more than what Return of the Jedi was made for, so you can just guess. And of course that is with it also going over budget, and it was a flop, and I don't even have to go into Hollywood accounting for that, because it made, at the higher end, 37.9 million at the box office. So there's that, which is kind of sad, because even though what I'm going to say about the film in this review, I do wonder how Lynch would have directed adaptations of the next two novels. That's probably as far as they would have gone if they had been able to, but it has my curiosity. Just in this, kind of in a similar manner to how I wonder how Jodorowsky would have directed his one, but that one more is very morbid, whereas this one is genuine. Now, as I mentioned in the last one, there were a couple attempts in between this film and the book's publication to adapt it. Of course, the aforementioned Jodorowsky one was the closest it came, or at least the most well-known of them, until we got to this one. And David Lynch, this is about the point in his career where he was really starting his rise up. I mean, of course, everyone talks about Eraserhead, his original film. And, of course, he directed Elephant Man for Mel Brooks, with Brooks production, and that one really does have his stamp of weirdness, and of course he went to do other stuff. Twin Peaks, enough said. Here, this is the only film he really does not talk about, or didn't for the longest time, and he considers it to be his only failure, one of which is, of course, it was a flop, but also because of something from behind the scenes, which I'm gonna read my little notes here, that these are taken from IMDb, like always, but a lot of these ones I've been able to look in other places. And just before I get to it, I have not watched the special features on the Arrow Blu-ray that I have in my collection down there. But I'm saving a lot of that talk for when I actually do a review of that one, which might be at the end of this review series, depending on how things go. Now, as I mentioned, he's refused numerous times to talk about it, mainly for a special edition release, which is why if you watch the TV version, Judas Booth is what he's credited as, instead of course, the, at the time, industry standard of Alan Smithy. And here's apparently something he said about the film in an interview once. Dune, I didn't have Final Cut on. It's the only film I made where I didn't have it. I didn't technically have Final Cut on The Elephant Man, but Mel Brooks gave it to me. And on Dune, I started selling out even in the script phase, knowing I didn't have Final Cut, and I sold out. So it was a slow dying, the death, and a terrible, terrible experience. I didn't know how it happened. I trusted it would work out, but I was very naive in the wrong move. In those days, the maximum length they figured I could have is 2 hours and 17 minutes, and that's what the film is, so they wouldn't lose a screening a day. So once again, it's money talking, and not for the film at all. So it was like completed, and it hurt it. And Patrick Stewart, who's in this film, later even added on to this comment by mentioning that every cast member lost 2 scenes to cuts made in editing. Now, what those scenes are, I am curious about. Hopefully they are shown in some form on the Blu-ray, but like I said, I haven't watched it, so no comment. Now, when the film was completed, the rough cut without the post-production effects, it ran over 4 hours, so you can definitely see why they really had to cut a lot there. And I would be curious to see that full hour rough cut, even if the effects in some of the scenes are crappy, just to see how much more of the novel they could have put in there. And Lynch's intended cut was almost 3 hours long, so another hour stuffed down to that. Now that would have been a Bender final version, and I'm going to assume that the TV cut is close to that. And of course there's Universal Pictures and the movie's financiers that went with the standard cut. And it was Dino De Laurentiis, Rafaela De Laurentiis, and Lynch who exercised numerous scenes. And during this, of course, as they do, they had to film new scenes that simplified or concentrated plot elements. And they added voice-over narrations, plus the introduction by Virginia Madsen. Now, to go with that whole thing of Virginia's character, Princess Irulan, narrating does fit, and it has a little bit of lore source in the novel, considering Irulan later would write down a lot of what happened. So her being the narrator definitely fits. And there are times in the film where you can definitely tell they filmed stuff to condense the plot. Because to get on to the story of this film, it is a double-edged sword. It's both faithful to its source material, while at the same time, due to how they have to rush certain plot elements and heavily abridge the story, it bastardizes it. So it's got that little ring there. It doesn't bastardize it to say as much as Kubrick's The Shining bastardizes the source material with what it does with our main character played by Jack Nicholson, but it does because of how much it rushes it. But even then, there's a lot of moments in the film where you're like, oh yeah, this is straight out of the book, and it might not be how you visualized the world while you were reading it, but it definitely brings it to life. And with the newer adaptation here, it definitely is a good way to look at it and see like how two different great directors interpreted the same source material. And of course, it makes you also wonder what Lynch probably could have done if they had split his film into two. You know, maybe it would have had the same reputation, or maybe it would have been looked at a lot more fonder. Who knows? Now, the plot, I did talk about it a little bit in the previous one, but simplify it. The Emperor, Shaddam IV, is reassigning which of the great houses in the known universe is controlling the planet Arrakis, also known as Dune, which is the only known source in the universe for the spice melange, which is used in a lot of things. Some people are addicted to it. The Bene Gesserit use it. But of course the Spicing Guild, more importantly, uses it for their freighters in order to travel through space. Because they need it. Now, with that, he reassigns it, like I said, from the house that currently has it, the Harkonnens, to the Atreides. Now, as the opening thing shows, which some of this stuff we don't find out until the sequel novel. So, this is one change that kind of reframes how we look at the character of Paul Atreides, but considering it's played by an actor who is older than the character's age, and definitely looks older than the character's age, so we get the Game of Thrones effect of aging up the characters in the adaptation, it kind of works. But it's just with other elements, it's like, now, he's doing this so that him and the Harkonnens could basically turn around and later slaughter the Atreides. They have to do this on the down low because the other houses in the Landsrat might be like, wait a minute, that's not right, especially since the current leader of House Atreides, Duke Leto, is very popular in the Landsrat. So, the Atreides go because it's their duty, and eventually the trap is sprung, they get killed, but Paul, the heir, and his mother, Lady Jessica, survive. They make contact with the indigenous people of Dune, the Fremen, and then they start Paul's plan for revenge, which of course ends with him forcing Shaddam to abdicate, marrying Irulan, and basically making it rain on Arrakis. Now, it does have a star-studded cast for when the movie was made, and these are just some of the people I'm going to go over. I mean, of course, you got Francesca Annis as Lady Jessica. Of course, she played Lady Macbeth in Polanski's adaptation of the Shakespeare play, and she was the widow of the Webb and Kroll. You got the legendary José Ferrer as Shaddam IV, and he does have a presence in the scenes he's in. It varies between him being a little backing down to the guild, and then there are moments where you can really sense his imperial authority, like a later scene where he's talking with the Baron. You got Freddie Jones as Thufir Hawat. Of course, he played Bites in The Elephant Man. He does fit the character, especially with those bushy eyebrows. But I'm just going to apply to one thing I'll mention in a moment. You got Richard Jordan as Duncan Idaho. who played Brigadier General Armistead in Gettysburg, and he was Pelt in The Hunt for Red October. Of course, like I said, Virginia Madsen is an Erlon. You got Max von Sydow as Dr. Kynes. Dean Stockwell as Dr. Yui. You got Kenneth McMillan as the Baron Harkonnen. Of course, he's been in other ones. He was in Amadeus. He was in Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon. Of course, Patrick Stewart in one of his early film roles as Gurney Halleck. And apparently he was cast originally as a mistake. And they were trying to replace the actor, and Lynch thought he was a different person, that he was hiring the same name. But I don't know what type of presence other Patrick Stewart would have, but this one definitely brought that Shakespearean presence to his character. You got Jürgen Prochnow as Duke Leto. You got, of course, Sting the musician as Fedor Raffer, one of the Baron's nephews. You got Paul Smith as his cousin, Raban. Of course, he also played Bluto in Popeye. You got Everett McGill as Stilgar. And, of course, you got Sean Young as Cheney. You got Alyssa Witt as Aaliyah, and you got Brad Dourif as Peter de Vils. And then, of course, Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides, our main character. It is a star-studded cast. More in retrospect than it probably was at the time, but even then you got a pretty good cast. Anyone that has José Ferrer in just a supporting role, you know is going to be star-studded, especially with Sting in there. Now, some of these characters that I mentioned, even though they're played by people that are competent, a lot of the cuts and how they abridge the story definitely hurt them. And I could definitely say that since I first watched this film before I read the book, and then watched it a couple times, one for this review after reading the book, it's definitely a case of, if you've never read the book, some of these characters you're going to wonder what is their whole thing. One of them, of course, for me, is the character of Duncan Idaho. When I first saw the film, I'm like, okay, he's someone that Paul knows and all that, but I didn't really get his importance. And his death, I kind of felt what Paul was feeling in the moment, but it didn't really leave a big impact with me. However, having read the book, I'm like, oh, that's how impactful. And that's one way I could definitely say the newer film adapted his death better. Whereas in this film, it kind of came off as a fart in church, other than, Paul feeling it. That's no slight against Jordan's performance and how he plays it, but just the scenes of him in the final film, there's not a lot there. So hopefully in the extended version that there's more scenes where you really get their feeling that build a little bit more to his death, but we're going to have to wait and see on that. Howitt, not really a lot there other than, he works for the Atreides, so a lot of the plot elements for him they include kind of fall flat. With Yue, you get his whole motivation there, and then mentioning the whole thing about his conditioning, so for what little of his plot is there, it works. Dr. Kynes gets the shaft other than the main part of his plot with it. Although there's two things in there because of what they had to abridge and change because of it that kind of have you scratching your head a little bit. One of them, if you're a movie-only watcher. And that is, why are the Harkonnens killing him? In the book, it makes sense because there's a little subplot before the Atreides go towards the desert to meet the Fremen where he is assisting them. So you can make the argument that the reason that they're doing it is, oh, he's a traitor. Here, it only just comes across as the Harkonnens being barbaric and very, very mean. Because they just basically kill him for no reason. And another thing, and this is definitely if you're a book watcher, is that they never mention the relationship between him and Cheney's character, because Dr. Kynes is Cheney's father. And by extension, what we see at the end, more or less, becomes Paul's father-in-law. So that's one element they never mentioned. So it was like, in the movie, you can make the argument maybe he is, and it's just not mentioned, maybe he isn't. But it's just something to bring up. Baron, he has a lot of his scenes there. Now, he is played very 80s, to put it nicely. Very over the top. But it definitely fits the tone of the film, though. And of course, it's because of that we get the famous quote from him, "He who controls the spice controls the universe." And of course the makeup they put on him, all the boils and stuff, the pus, and then that weird suit he wears that makes him float. Which I know some people who are fans of the book will roll their eyes at that, but it fits the tone of the film, so I let it slide a bit. And as for the ugliness on him, considering the route they're going with, I think it fits with how Lynch adapted this film, especially with what we know of him just from Eraserhead. Because they never touch on it in the film, but the reason that the Baron is so corpulent is because of something he did in his past. And with this, it kind of cuts off another little plot revelation that they cut out of this one, and that is that Paul and the Baron are related. Because the Baron is Lady Jessica's biological father. And this goes in with the Bene Gesserit breeding program. Jessica's mother had to go approach the Baron in order for him to have a child with her. Because even though, and this is something they only kind of hint at in the movie, but it's up to you how you look at it, whether you look at it as this being that or him just being a predator. And that is that the Baron is gay. Now, of course, he's gay, but instead of having healthy relationships, he truly prefers to be a rapist and predator, which you get in that one scene. Now, because of that, he has approached those like, if you're not going to marry, we at least want to make use of your seed. First time, doesn't work. Second time, he gets so upset, he decides to assault the Bene Gesserit. Because of that, they basically punish him by infecting him with a disease that makes him super corpulent. Now, you make the argument in the film that it also gives him all the other stuff, which definitely fits. It is a nice little punishment for the Baron. But he kind of seems to revel in it, though. But he's so corpulent, of course, that's why he has this thing where he has to float. Now, the whole thing with him being related to the Baron, going with the whole breeding program, it's them trying to make their own version of the savior that Paul becomes. But they're not expecting it for another generation, and that's why they're mad that, I know I'm going to a bunch of lore explanations here, but I got to in order to get from note to note. That's why the Bene Gesserit are upset with Jessica, because she had a son instead of a daughter. Like, oh, you thought you could have the Kwisatz Haderach yourself, blah. Well, but because of that DNA, Paul, along with his training and him going down this road, he ends up becoming it. They weren't expecting it to happen to the next one when they had another proper breeding between the Atreides and the Harkonnens, but it came in a bit early. Now, the Baron's nephews, Fade Ralpher, we get a little bit of the fact that he's sadistic there just from how Sting plays him and how he articulates the few bits of dialogue he has. Rabban, other than like his scenes in battle, you don't really get how brutal he's supposed to be. I mean, his nickname is the Beast. And that's nothing against Paul Smith. Smith, just from how he played Bluto alone, I can see him playing Rabban. It's just, maybe he had stuff that was cut, but it just doesn't work here as well as it should have. It's also weird seeing Smith without the beard, because you go from seeing him full beard like me in 1980s Bluto, here, without it, he looks so babyface. Maybe it's also the lighting and any makeup that they put on him that added to it. A lot of Paul's arc is sped up because of the shorter runtime and all that. But the cliff notes are there, where he goes from being someone that's a novice with the power that he inherited and was taught by his mother, to being the Kwisatz Haderach, to where he can really use the voice. His control of the Fremen is to the point where they're helping him with his revenge. And of course he makes it rain on Arrakis. But of course in doing so, it does really kill the point that Herbert was trying to make with his character, and that is, instead of a man becoming a god like we see here, the whole point was, maybe our leaders aren't the best people, but that's really more something we see in the next parts. And they even touch on, of course, with Paul's son Leto II, with him becoming the imp, the god emperor worm. Of course, he does it with the best intentions, but a lot of the worst things that humanity have done, someone could say they were doing it with the best intentions. And of course, one thing that really is rushed is Paul and Chani's relationship. I mean, they meet after Paul has been dreaming about her because of his spice dreams. And then their relationship starts to blossom off camera. So that's one part that's like, eh. And they don't really have the best chemistry. It's kind of hard to believe them as lovers. They look good together, I'll say, but maybe part of that is also how fast it goes. But it's like, that's why I hope there's a couple scenes in them that ended up on the cutting room floor that's in the other cut. Brad Dourif is Piter. He is definitely one thing I'll say that this movie does better than the other one. I mean, the Piter in the newer film, he has that right look because of who they cast. But he doesn't really have a presence for me. I mean, it's a little bit more subtle, you could say, and I definitely guess it fits the tone of that one. But it's hard to say you are the better version of a character when you're going up against the legendary Brad Dourif. I mean, Brad Dourif, his look and just the intensity in his voice, he is excellent in this character. It's a shame that Piter meets his end around the halfway mark of the film. And then no more, because Brad Dourif is always amazing to watch. Even when it's a know-nothing role or like a minor character comparatively, he's always fun to watch. Which, Everett McGill is Stilgar. He does a pretty decent job for what little he has there. Of course, he's in the famous worm riding scene. And of the ones I have notes for here, the only other... Virginia Madsen, I mean, other than what I mentioned about her being the narrator, for the few scenes she's in, she does a decent job. I mean, she has the right look. I believe her as a princess, and there's not really much else to talk about her. And, of course, we got Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck. I've already mentioned how his Shakespearean pathos and all that. He really does an excellent job as Gurney. The way he just enunciates every line, you believe him as a Atreides man who can kill people. And he's in one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie, and that is when Gurney and Paul reunite on Arrakis. And what carries that is how Patrick plays this scene, where he's in it and he's like not believing his eyes, and then when he realizes he is actually seeing Paul, the emotion in his voice when they hug, he's like, young Paul. And then of course after the fact, when he is now in Paul's entourage, when he's like, this is a Harkonnen animal. Just the way he says Harkonnen and animal, you really believe that Gurney hates Harkonnens with every fiber of his being, and that they are less than human. Which of course goes with Gurney's backstory of being a slave to a Harkonnen before. It's not mentioned in this one, but definitely fits still. Now, I'll go back up here. Oh yeah. The cinematography in the movie was done by Freddie Francis, who of course has been involved with some films I mentioned before. He directed Dracula Has Risen from the Grave in the 70s version of Tales from the Crypt. He also did, as a cinematographer, Never Take Sweets from a Stranger, which is a film I'm interested in seeing because of it being mentioned in a couple of the Hammer DVDs I have. Return to Oz, childhood favorite of mine. Cape Fear. And of course, The Elephant Man. And Toto was responsible for the score. So definitely it has that 80s vibe, but I just love the score, the main theme, and of course the riding the worm theme. Definitely fits. Now, this movie was filmed in Churubusco Studios in Mexico City. Part of the reason for this is because it's close to a desert, and the peso was devalued at the time. And they were able to make the film for a quarter of what it would have cost with. So what it was made for, ooh, just imagine how much more it would have cost, probably close to $100 million. Now, of course, because of that, they had a lot of cockroach infestations. They had to deal with Mexico's Byzantine-style bureaucracy. They had brownouts, where they needed to have backup generators on hand. They had a very, very primitive phone network with only one direct line to the production office. Worse smog than LA. Now, of course, remember, this is Mexico City in the 80s. And then, of course, I think we all know what the last one's going to be. Montezuma's revenge, afflicting half of the crew. You know, they say don't drink the water, don't eat the food because of that. Well, there's that. And of course, it's not the only Hollywood production in the 80s that suffered from that. If I remember right, Predator had that same issue, and of course they had that issue, of course a different country, but they also had that issue on Raiders of the Lost Ark. And of course, while down there, they had to build 80 sets on 16 sound stages, and it had a production crew of 1,700. So you definitely see why the budget went to what it was. Now, as you can kind of guess from how I'm talking about the film, I do like the film, and most of my issues stem from how they abridge it. Now, maybe it's because I also saw the film later in life. I don't hold it in as high regard as some of my contemporaries might. Like, I believe Mike, OCP Communications, probably enjoys the film a bit more than I do, but I haven't talked with him about the film specifically, and I haven't seen him talk about the film in a while, so don't quote me on that. It definitely is a film, if I ever do have children, that I wouldn't mind watching with them. Definitely one I will watch all the time, or whenever the mood strikes me. It's just probably one of those instances of reading the book kind of did spoil. And I don't necessarily hurt the film for me, it just made me see the issues with the story pacing a bit more. Now, let's get down to a lot of the notes I have on here. Oh yeah, before I get to that, I didn't write them down, but I note one of the issues that critics at the time had with the film, other than probably the pacing of the story, was some of the special effects. And I'm not going to lie, like a couple moments with the worm, you can definitely tell that they were using a smaller model, but I like the design of the worm. I like the look of Arrakis, especially when the worm was coming out, how it has that red skyline on it. Definitely fits for a desert planet where they're looking for spice. The worm sign thing with the electricity a bit much, but like I said before, fits the tone of the film, so it's one interpretation I can go with. I know people are probably a little bit more stickler for how the book is written, will probably be like, "Nee," but I'm not that much of a stickler when it comes to something like that. In certain regards, I am like character of Jack Torrance, but that's another thing we'll talk about in another video. Now, we're going to get to some of the interesting little trivia I got here. Now we're going to circle back to Sean Young. Lynch and Rafaela arranged a screen test in New York City for her. Young's agent never told her about the meeting. Why is it there's a lot of these stories about agents basically either saying no on their client's behalf without telling their client, or basically just not telling their client at all? It's like, I know you're the representative, but how about you run it by the person first like you're supposed to get paid for? But a fun little coincidence, she was booked on the same flight that evening to LA that they were. Lynch and De Laurentiis missed their flight, and they ended up catching that same flight, like I said, and during the flight, De Laurentiis noticed Young and told Lynch, "Bet that girl's an actress." And a flight attendant happened to be walking by and told the pair, "Oh, that's Sean Young." And, De Laurentiis confronted Young about standing them up, and the misunderstanding was sorted out, and they ended up drinking champagne and reading the script together upon their return to LA. So, nice little moment there for them. Now, Sting, he was originally supposed to have a nude scene in this movie. The scene where he steps out of the steam bath. He was supposed to have been nude, but the studio panicked, and they told the costume designers to put something on him, so they made that weird-looking G-string at the last minute. Now, with how the scene is set up, it probably would have made more sense for him to be nude, but even in the G-string, it makes sense in the moment, especially with how the characters are interacting without dialogue. Now, the suits that we see the guild members wearing in their scenes were actually made from body bags that were found in a disused fire station dating back to the early 1920s. And yes, the bags had actually been used several times, and this was kept from the cast members until after shooting was completed. I could just imagine how they reacted. Probably similar to how Ace Ventura acted when he found out Einhorn was Finkel, or more or less the ending part of it. Now, Patrick Stewart, this is another little fun thing about him. He said that the still suit that they had to wear, which I love the design of the still suits in this one, that's one thing I really like looking about between all these Dune adaptations, is how they're similar because of how they're described in the novel, but how each production and costume designer interprets what Herbert described them as differently. Now, Patrick said that the still suit was the most uncomfortable costume he had ever worn. Max von Sydow said the same thing, but also that he put up with it because he loved the way it made his body look. And of course, this goes back to my whole thing about them abridging. But during the movie's original release, the studio had cheat sheets explaining much of the movie's setting and its more obscure vocabulary handed out to the moviegoers, which, at the time it was released, I could definitely see how that hurt the film experience for some people. It was like, really? I need to do homework to enjoy this? Pfft, that sucks, which, yeah, I get it. It definitely would hurt it a tad there. And now, Kwisatz Haderach, which is what they call Paul, it means jumping the path. And it's a term that's used in the Talmud, which, if you don't know, that's the name of the Jewish Bible. The Torah is just one part of it. And other Jewish folklore legends. So it kind of goes with the whole Middle Eastern vibe of it, which, that's one thing that's really toned down in this film, is that you don't really get a lot of that Middle Eastern influence in the film, which, considering when this film was made, I can kind of get it. I mean, we're near the ass end of the Cold War, but we're still in the Cold War, and I didn't write down the dates, but this is probably around the time either Afghanistan was about to pop off or was popping off, but it was also following the Iranian crisis, so there was probably still some sentiment there. Now, like with the newer film, I think if the newer film was made in the mid-2000s, they probably would have faced backlash about not toning that down, but that's neither here nor there. There's still some there, but not as much. Now, I mentioned the whole thing about Carino becoming the historian. I know one thing that people are probably going to have an issue with, and I'm sorry I mentioned this so late, is that in addition to Irulan's narration, we also get some of the characters' inner monologues. Maybe it's the novel lover in me. Maybe it's also the soliloquy and aside theater lover in me, but I have no issue when we hear a character's inner monologue. As long as it fits the story, as long as it fits the type of film it is, and as long as it definitely helps us get a little bit more into it. Now, there's the thing of show, don't tell. Yeah. But like I said, as the theater lover in me, I do like it. Like in some Shakespeare ones, it's probably the best way to do his little asides. Here, it's a nice way to work in some more film dialogue. Some more dialogue, from the book. Especially stuff if there was stuff they were thinking in there. And you can definitely tell what they're doing. Especially for some of the characters where they don't have as many scenes as they probably should. Now here is something fun. Despite what I'll probably say with him when I bring this guy up when I'm doing another Star Trek video, Harlan Ellison was one of the few who was positive towards the film at the time, and I gotta give him a praise for this. The good lover and I'm gonna mess up the word. Lover of science fiction that he was. He felt that it failed due to the critics being biased due to screenings being cancelled. Which, just to go with his little conspiracy theory there, which I can buy, considering how fickle some people can be, if that's the case, then safely we can ignore those individual critics and their complaints, because it's just being added to because of them feeling scorned. But if not, it's just a conspiracy thing. But it is an interesting little tidbit I thought I'd bring up. All in all, Dune 84, it's a pretty fun film. While it is way too fast-paced from a story perspective, because of that, it doesn't really feel like it drags. But there are moments where it's like, okay, that was a little abrupt. I mean, the acting is pretty decent for what this type of film is. And with how fast the actors have to do their story beats, even with what was cut out. Special effects, I think, are pretty good for the time period. And with how much they had to do in the whole film, like the worms, the sets, costume design, I think is excellent. I mean, a good cast, the score, excellent. I mean, Lynch's direction. I mean, he did have a little bit of those constraints from the studio, and like he felt that he was selling out the whole time, but you definitely could tell this is a David Lynch film, and his fingerprints are on the visuals. But it's a little bit more restrained, but when they come out, you can definitely tell it's him. It's kind of like when you're watching a Tim Burton film, and he's not getting as crazy with his Burton-esque visuals. Like, even though it was his first film by comparison, like with Pee-wee's Big Adventure, You could tell that it's a Burton film just from how it's shot, how some of the stuff is. But when it allows for his more crazy and esoteric stuff, like Large Marge and, of course, the nightmare scenes, you really can tell it's his film. It's that same thing. That when it allows it, you really can see that Lynch is playing around with the things. And, of course, the spice must flow. That's really all there is to say about this one. I'm sorry if I seem a little out of it, because just, I'm recording this at this time. It's after midnight, and it's been over a week since I watched this. Plus, if you've been reading the things, getting over a cold, which you can tell is still affecting a little bit of my voice. And of course, the next one is going to be Dune Part 1, the first half of the newer adaptation. And of course, after that will be the second half once it drops. Whether I'll see it early or not, I don't know yet. And then, if I have the time, hopefully get around to watching the Blu-ray so I can give my thoughts on that one. But of course, that is down another row in the dunes.